Thank you very much, Julius, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to have an opportunity to discuss with you about where we are in the world of trade policy. The way I would like to structure my talk would be to start with a few more general reflections about the whole issue about geopolitics and trade policy. Then to go into WTO, where I'm sure you will be interested in getting my impressions from the last WTO Ministerial, but I will try to put it a little bit in a broader background about what are the challenges being faced by the multilateral trading system. And at the end, if there's time, I would like to say a few more general words about European Union trade policy beyond the WTO. But to first start on the whole question of geopolitics and trade, I think a few years ago, if I have been given a title to give a talk here in LSE, it would be very rare that I would have chosen to talk about geopolitics and trade, because geopolitics is something that foreign policy people do. We trade policy practitioners do something else. And in a way, this is a reflection about how much the world has changed. I mean, if you look into the last 30 years, since 1989, to put one starting point, we have been conducting trade policy in an environment characterized by geopolitical stability and underpinned by a rule-based trading system where the rules were generally respected by all the key players in the system. And that's clearly not the world in which we are living today. So this is not something we have changed from one day to the other. I mean, if you actually look into the last 30 years, it, by the way, have been extremely important years in terms of the expansion of trade, in terms of the expansion of investment, in terms of the contribution that trade and investment have made towards tackling poverty globally. If you look into the last 30 years, I would think that the inflection point probably happened at some point in time with the financial crisis in 2008. That was the moment when trade stopped growing. It stabilized at a very high level, but it stabilized, and was also more or less the time when there was a change of economic policy in China. And contrary to what was the initial expectation, that China was going to move much more in the direction of a market economy, China under Xi Jinping started to reinforce the role of the state in the economy. Then you have, of course, the election of President Trump in the United States, the start of the China-US trade war, and more or less. In the beginning, this was characterized as a more classical type of trade conflict. It very clearly evolved into a technology conflict and a broader geopolitical confrontation. And that is the world that we are living today, which is a very different world from the one that we have been living over the last 30 years. And that means that if you are a trade policy practitioner, you cannot ignore geopolitics anymore. You have to be aware that you are living in a very unstable geopolitical environment, and you have to be aware that what you are doing on trade also has geopolitical implications. So that's why I thought that in order to give a title to this conference, I will talk about the new geopolitics of trade. Of course, I'm not a geopolitician. I'm not someone who can give you a prediction about how the world is going to evolve in the next 10 years. But as if you want to plan trade policy, you need to work under certain assumptions. And I would say that the first assumption is that we are not going back to the world in the past. The geopolitical tensions between the United States and China are here to stay. The question is, are they going to escalate? Is there a risk that this becomes somehow of an uncontrolled situation, or is it going to be possible to have something which one could characterize more as a more managed process of strategic competition between the United States and China? One way or the other, we are not going back to the old days of engagement between the US and China, and that means that we need to be ready to bear in mind that we are going to be facing a much more unstable global trading environment. I'm not talking for the time being about Russia. If you want, I can talk about Russia when we come to the question, because Russia, quite frankly, is not such a significant economic player as China is. Now, as I said, what I think one can hope is that this conflict between the US and China is not going to prevent cooperation. It's not going to prevent cooperation in a number of areas. including on the whole question about how to try to preserve a rule-based global trading system. Now, if you look into the economic situation, it is clear that we are facing, again, a very unstable economic environment, risk of stagflation, risk of a debt crisis for low and middle income countries, and again, the whole geopolitical tensions is going to also make it much more difficult to manage the functioning of multilateral institutions. And finally, one should not forget that the next 10 years are also going to be critical from the point of view of the climate transition. In what happens between now and 2030 is going to be critical to determine whether or not we can put the economy in the path towards net zero. And again, that will require cooperation and really how you can achieve cooperation in an environment of geopolitical conflict. So if you want to see a bit the global picture, that's the way that I see it. The last 30 years, which were characterized by geopolitical instability, is not the kind of world that we're going to be living over the next decade. It's going to be a much more tense world. It's going to be a world where the risk of conflict is going to be very significant. And that's why, from our point of view, it is very important in that context to see what can be done to maintain well-functioning multilateral institutions. And there's where I come to the whole question of the WTO. The WTO, in a way, was one of the main features that made it possible to have an expansion of trade over the last 30 years, because it provided the stability of a system of rules backed by an effective and functioning dispute settlement system, and because it also provided a forum for negotiation among countries about market opening and about rules. Now, if you look, however, into the history of the WTO since it was created, I think you can make the case that the WTO has been much better in performing its role of stability through the rule-based trading system and its dispute settlement, and much less effective as a forum for negotiations. There are many reasons for that, and I would be happy, of course, to enter into that debate. But if you look into the record of the WTO, in 25 years since it was created, until last week in Geneva, we have only been able to negotiate one new multilateral agreement, basically about facilitating customs procedures, and one important agreement to eliminate export subsidies in the agricultural sector. Now, two legally binding agreements in 25 years is not necessarily a very impressive record. There was, of course, an attempt to create a different dynamic in 2001 when the Doha Development Agenda was launched. At the moment of geopolitical optimism, if you want to characterize it that way. But by 2008, it was very clear that it was not possible to bring these negotiations to conclusion. And the fundamental reason for that was a strong divergences of views about how to deal with development. So in a way, these problems relating to the negotiation function of the WTO predate the geopolitical conflicts. They have much more to do with different views about WTO members about how to tackle development issues in the context of the WTO. But of course, the fact that China considers itself to be a developing country and the lack of trust between China and the United States implies an even greater challenge in terms of getting the WTO properly functioning as a negotiating forum. So this was a rather gloomy environment which predated the negotiation that we had in Geneva 10 days ago. Now, one element which I would like to emphasize is that despite this complex geopolitical environment, we in the European Union are convinced that it is absolutely necessary to have a functioning multilateral institution. And that's why we decided when we were defining our trade policy strategy last year, we decided to give priority to the idea of reforming the WTO. And we published a little leaflet, which is still available, with our ideas about how to reform the WTO. Now, I want to say that because, quite frankly, we were sometimes criticized that we were being naive, that in the current very complex geopolitical environment, how one could expect to get things happening in the WTO, that it was something that the WTO corresponded to a different world, to the one that we are living today. So I have to say that it is with some degree of satisfaction that I can say, despite the very difficult geopolitical context, despite the conflict between the United States and China, despite the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and then the meetings in Geneva happening in this extremely difficult context, despite all that, I think it is fair to say that the results of this ministerial meeting of the WTO are probably among the most significant, if not the most significant, that have been achieved in the 25 years of the WTO history. I will come later into the reasons for that, but what I would like to offer you is a bit of an indication about what have been the outcomes of the ministerial negotiations that took place 10 days ago in Geneva. Now, the first and perhaps the most significant result was an agreement to introduce disciplines on fisheries subsidies. Now, this was important because first, it was the first time that an agreement was negotiated in the WTO, which had as a fundamental objective to promote sustainability, but also because the agreement, it is more ambitious than anything that has been negotiated so far internationally on the issue of fisheries subsidies. If you look into the famous CPTPP, I never remember, the Trans-Pacific Progressive Partnership Agreement, it has provisions on the fisheries subsidies. If you look into USMCA, the agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, it has provisions on fisheries subsidies. Well, the WTO agreement that we negotiated 10 days ago goes significantly beyond what those agreements provide for. And particularly includes something which is very important, which is a total prohibition on any subsidy being granted to vessels which operate in the unregulated high seas. And the reason why this is important is because this is one of the main concerns about Chinese subsidies practices. I mean, China is at this point in time the main fishing nation in the unregulated high seas. And in the context of the negotiations in Geneva, they had to agree on a total prohibition on continuing to provide those type of subsidies. Now, the agreement includes other elements. It includes some elements relating to what to do in the case of overfished stocks. It includes some elements relating to illegal fishing practices. But I would say it is this element of this prohibition on subsidies in the unregulated high seas, which I think is particularly significant because it goes beyond what has been done in any agreement so far, and because it shows that in the context of the WTO, you can actually create the conditions in which China needs to make real significant economic concessions. I mean, there was a dynamic in the negotiations. It was very clear that although this was an issue that was difficult for China, there was clear that the United States, the European Union, Africa, all countries wanted to have this element in the agreement. It was therefore very difficult to imagine that China would be in a position to propose. Now, the agreement is not perfect. I mean, we had to compromise in the end and leave one important element for later. And we have agreed to continue negotiating, hopefully to reach broader, more comprehensive disciplines on subsidies by the time of the next ministerial meeting. But I think that in terms of having something which is economically significant based on sustainability concerns, is a very important signal that the WTO can deliver outcomes which are meaningful and which can change practices of important trade relations. Now, the second element which I would highlight is the decision on a waiver related to COVID-19 vaccines. Again, an issue which, as you know, was extremely controversial. There was many different perspectives on what to do in order to facilitate the production of vaccines in developing countries. And as a result of intensive negotiations, primarily between the European Union and South Africa, although I wouldn't say only, because the whole process started as a discussion between the European Union and South Africa to try to identify a compromise, something that would meet the expectations of South Africa to make it easier for them to produce COVID-19 vaccines, and quite frankly to have better leverage vis-a-vis the pharmaceutical companies. But this discussion between the European Union and South Africa then went into a somewhat bigger group, including the United States and India, and finally was presented by the Director General to the membership. There was a lot of discussions throughout the whole week of the ministerial meeting, but at the end of the day, the outcome is very much inspired in what had already been discussed between South Africa and the European Union. This waiver, for the time being, only applies to vaccines, but it is envisaged that in 6 months' time, a decision will be taken about whether to extend it also for diagnostics and therapeutics. And one element in this agreement, which I also think is very important and significant from a broader systemic perspective, is what the decision provides in terms of the treatment of China. Now, one issue that was very clear in the whole discussion relating to this waiver was that the United States made extremely clear that they could never agree to a waiver if China could avail itself of the provisions of this waiver. And then how to find a formula that would be acceptable to the United States and to China was one of the most difficult issues during the negotiations. It's something that was basically discussed bilaterally between China and the United States, with the mediation, I would say, of the Director General, and that was only decided at the very last minute of the conference at 4 o'clock in the morning, if I remember correctly. And if you actually look into what was agreed, I think it's extremely interesting because it might provide an answer to one of the most difficult issues in the WTO, which is how to ensure that you can actually negotiate agreements which include a special and differential treatment, where China, the largest trading nation, would not avail itself of a special and differential treatment. The formula which is included basically says that those developing countries that have production capacity are encouraged not to make use of the waiver, that it is taken note that a number of countries have stated that they do not intend to use the waiver. The name China is not mentioned, but it refers to a meeting where China formally stated that they do not intend to make use of the waiver, and that then this is now a legally binding commitment. So it has been, the fundamental objective of the United States was to be clear that it was a legally binding commitment, and the fundamental element for China was to be clear, this is not something that has been imposed upon us, this is an autonomous decision that we have taken, and we would not avail ourselves of this waiver. And the way that was actually reconciled in this provision, in my view, would provide an important pointer about how to deal with these issues also in future negotiations, including, by the way, on fugitive subsidies, because the element that we could not agree on fugitive subsidies were those provisions of the agreement which included a special differential treatment. So by the way, we have now an agreement in the WTO which has no special and differential treatment, which is first, because the provision which included a special differential treatment is the one where no agreement could be reached and which will need to be tackled at a later point in time. Now, the third element, which I think is very significant about the outcome of the ministerial meeting, was the agreement to start negotiations on WTO reform, very broad negotiations that cover all aspects of the activities of the WTO. That includes also, by the way, development, because it's clear that WTO reform is not just about institutions, it is also about trying to see where it's possible to find a common narrative about what the WTO should be doing in support of development, and to try to reconcile the very different perspectives on that. So that has also been included as one of the elements that will need to be part of the WTO reform discussions. But very critically, it includes a commitment that no later than 2024, that is normally before the next US presidential elections, there should be again a fully functioning dispute settlement system in the WTO. The features of that system are not indicated in the decision. That is now to negotiate, and we will need to see what the United States actually brings to this discussion. But it's very clear that there is now formally a commitment to find a resolution that makes it again the fully functioning dispute settlement system no later than 2024. So these are the three elements coming from MC12 that I would say are particularly significant, particularly important. There were other decisions. There were also some decisions relating to food security, some decisions relating to the WTO response to the pandemic beyond the issue of intellectual property. A very difficult discussion about the continuation of the e-commerce moratorium. For those of you who are aware, I think since 1995, I believe, there has been a moratorium agreed in the WTO on the imposition of import duties on e-commerce. And this year it was an extremely difficult discussion. There was a number of countries, notably India, South Africa, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, that were basically arguing that this moratorium was limiting their policy space, that there was no longer any justification to maintain it. And it was a very difficult negotiation to agree, at least to extend it until the next ministerial meeting. Now, between now and then, of course, we will need to engage in the discussion to try to understand better the concerns that some countries have about policy space, to see where it is possible to find a more permanent resolution on this matter. A few words about the dynamics of the negotiations, because, as I said, this ministerial meeting took place in a very tense geopolitical environment with the war in Ukraine. Russia was not a factor in the negotiations. We have made very clear that we were not ready to enter into any kind of negotiations with the Russian Federation. So in all the informal negotiating meetings where we and others participated, the Russian Federation was not there. They were consulted separately, but at the same time, they never tried to interfere with trying to get to an outcome of the discussions. We obviously played an important role. We were among those who were insisting from the very beginning that this was a critical ministerial, that it was not possible to aim just for a very limited outcome, that we should really aim to tackle at least the 4 or 5 critical issues on which it was important to show that the WTO was responding to the concerns of the global community. We were normally very much supported by a coalition of countries called the Ottawa Group, which includes the UK, it includes Canada, it includes Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, so a number of trading nations, but we are also strongly supporters of multilateralism and WTO reform. Now, in terms of the position of some of the other key players, I would have to say that both the United States and China were obviously actively engaged, but they were not leading. They were taking much more of a backseat. Obviously, I think the United States was an important player on the fisheries subsidies negotiation, and I'm sure that the presence of the United States was one of the factors that could lead to an outcome that was high ambitious. But in most areas, the United States was not very actively engaged. Apart, of course, as I mentioned, there are discussions with China about how to deal with this issue about the treatment of China under the winter. China was also engaged in the different issues. They were very concerned, by the way, about the possibility of termination of the e-commerce moratorium. So they were very active on trying to ensure there was a compromise to move forward on the e-commerce moratorium. Obviously, China has a lot of digital companies who will be negatively affected if the e-commerce moratorium was going to stop. But all in all, I would say China did not actually take either a very leading role within the negotiations. There was, however, a very important presence of Africa. You actually look into some of the key negotiations, I would say South Africa and more broadly the ACP countries were key players on all the areas of negotiation. On the whole question of fishery subsidies, the final negotiation took place basically between the ACP, the United States, the European Union, India, China, and a few other countries, because the ACP made very clear we can accept an agreement on fishery subsidies which is not comprehensive, only on condition that there are clear guarantees that what we cannot agree this time is going to be tackled effectively. And we are very concerned that if we actually leave certain things to one side, they would never be concluded. I mean, the LSE were very happy, I would say, about the type of approach that we were developing on the special and differential treatment and the disciplines that would apply to subsidies leading to overfishing or overcapacities. So they were quite disappointed when, after this intervention by India, it was very clear that this could not be agreed at this ministerial meeting, and they very much insisted we will only agree on this partial deal if there are clear guarantees that the rest is also going to be done. And if you actually look into the outcome of the negotiations, it was very interesting, because on the one hand, there's now a commitment to try to get the rest done by the next ministerial meeting. But it's also something quite new, which I don't think has ever happened in any WTO agreement, which is a sunset clause, which basically means that if 4 years after the entry into force of this first phase fisheries subsidies agreement, the rest of the negotiations have not been concluded, the agreement will terminate unless the General Council decides to extend it. Again, it's something which is quite new, and it was basically the ACP which insisted in the last negotiations happening late in the morning of the last night that this would be the only condition on which they could actually agree on the conclusion of the partial agreement. And as I indicated before, on the whole negotiation relating to the TRIPS waiver, it was largely a negotiation between South Africa and the European Union. I think it had a lot of discussion to understand what were the reasons why South Africa felt that they needed to have these additional flexibilities in order to make it possible for them to produce vaccines. So I think there was a very intensive discussions between us and South Africa. And on the e-commerce moratorium, again, the final discussions were between the South African Trade Minister and EVP Dombrovskis to try to find a formula that was accepted for both sides and which could then also be more generally acceptable. Of course, Dr. Negosi played a critical role. I think that having a very forceful Director General ready to push everyone to try to come to an outcome was also very instrumental in terms of getting the result. Finally, a few words about the position of India. India, those of you who have been observers of multilateral trade negotiations, as you know, normally tends to be the most difficult player in the WTO, always ready to block if necessary to defend its interests. And quite frankly, during the first 3 days of the negotiations, we were very concerned because India was being very, very difficult across the board on every negotiating area. And we felt that we might actually therefore end again with a failed ministerial meeting. Then a decision was taken to extend the negotiations for 1 day. And India started to play much more constructively. Obviously, after they had secured their defensive interests, it was mostly on fisheries. But for instance, on other issues, they have been pushing very hard on agriculture. They realized it was not possible to reach an agreement in line with what their expectation was, and that therefore they became much more ready to compromise. Now, I think that in my view this might be significant because it also has been the first time we have seen actually an Indian minister presenting the outcome of a WTO negotiation as something which is positive and something which India has played a role in terms of construction. So hopefully this will be a signal in the future we may actually have also a more constructive engagement from India in future WTO negotiations. Now, what in my view, going back to the whole question of the geopolitics of trade, what in my view this shows is that despite the current geopolitical environment, or precisely because of the current geopolitical environment, there is a general awareness about the serious risk of a collapse of the ministerial meeting. The WTO is obviously in a very delicate situation. If this ministerial meeting had actually not produced any outcome, as was the case, by the way, 5 years ago, there was a ministerial meeting in Buenos Aires where basically ministers could not agree on anything, and they just agreed to disagree. If you have had something of that nature 1 week ago in Geneva, or you have had a result that was so small that it would quite clearly not pass the laughing test, I think this would have been a clear signal that we no longer have a multilateral institution for trade. And I think that this is something that, in my view, all players are aware about the serious consequence of such situation, and that's why there was a willingness to compromise that is not normally so common in multilateral trade negotiations. Now, this being said, I think we also should avoid being over-optimistic. I mean, we are not always going to be in the same geopolitical context that we were in this particular meeting. We need now to see how far we are going to be able to make progress on the issues which we have ahead of us, which are actually very difficult. Obviously, for instance, reform of WTO dispute settlement is for us a fundamental interest, but it's going to require the United States being able to come forward and to indicate what changes they want to see in the way that the dispute settlement system, operates, and then to see whether or not it's possible to reach an agreement that results in a workable system of WTO dispute settlement. The discussion about development is not going to be simple. I think it's something that we would really need to confront head-on. We will need to be able to really understand what is the right balance between policy space and the world of rules, and how you can actually design a special and differential treatment in a manner which takes into account the different situations of developing countries. So all in all, I would say it has been an important first step, but it by no means a guarantee that we can actually have a fully functioning multilateral trade institution. That's why I said it from the point of view of the European Union, we certainly intend to persevere. We intend to continue to try to work with others to make sure that with this positive dynamic that was generated in this ministerial meeting can result in restoring the functioning dispute settlement system, in seeing how far we can also modernize the rules of the WTO on a number of areas, including, for instance, on the whole issue of e-commerce. So I don't know exactly how much time I have left. Do you have time? Yeah. But I mean, I would probably leave some of the discussions about WTO reform for the discussion. I would probably be interested to answer two questions that you may have about the issues which are going to be in the agenda for the WTO for the next ministerial meeting. But I would like to say a few words which are a little bit broader in terms of the Union trade policy. Because what is clear is that in the new geopolitical environment, I think one is going to need to develop a trade policy which is flexible enough to respond to what is going to be an unstable and somewhat unpredictable global environment. For us, it's always going to be important to work on making WTO a functioning multilateral institution. As a dispute settlement is key, but the more that we can actually modernize the rules, the better. But it's clear that we cannot just simply rely on the WTO. That's why we think that the bilateral trade agenda continues to be extremely important. The European Union has developed a very broad network of trade agreements, but in the current geopolitical context, with the consequences of losing the Russian market, it is clear that there is an increasing appetite to try to go further and to complete our network of trade agreements in Latin America, in the Indo-Pacific. There is also a lot of interest in seeing how we can deepen our engagement with Africa, and that will require probably new formulas that respond also to the expectations of African countries for industrialization, and see how one can devise new types of economic engagement with Africa. So I think you would see on the one hand, I think continuous European Union investment in trying to make the WTO work better. At the same time, a developing of our bilateral trade partnerships, trying to see also how these trade partnerships can help to enhance resilience of value chains, how they can also be forms for cooperation on regulatory issues, because increasingly those are the issues where where the real concerns are in terms of trade. It's not so much the tariff, it is much more how to ensure the better interaction between different regulatory regimes, or how to deal with this regulatory cooperation dimension in our trade agreements. I think it's going to be an increase in the focus. And then there's the whole question, by the way, since you mentioned the G7, I'm sure it's going to be very, very much discussed in the G7, of how to manage the trade security interface. Because it is clear that in the current geopolitical context, there are certain issues which, quite frankly, are never going to be tackled through multilateral rules. If you are looking into investment screening, if you are looking into export controls, if you are looking into how to respond to coercion when the country tries to weaponize international trade, this is a whole trade and security interface, which is very novel for us in trade, because it's not the sort of issue that we were used to dealing with in the past, but which is becoming increasingly important. We are developing a number of autonomous instruments in this field, but it is clear that it's also an issue which would make a lot of sense to see how we can cooperate with like-minded market democracies. Exactly how to do it, how to develop the most efficient way to develop this cooperation in the trade and security nexus is something which is still very much open. There are discussions going that in the G7, because clearly it is something that involves also countries which are not in the G7, but we probably also have similar type of concepts. So if you want, I would see a trade policy architecture that includes, on the one hand, support for a reformed multilateral payment system. On the other hand, a network of preferential trade relationships that also helps to enhance regulatory cooperation and regulatory dialogue. And then probably a smaller circle of cooperation among like-minded democracies that look into how to manage the trade and security, nexus. So I think I would probably leave it at this point.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. That was a wonderful tour d'horizon of all the issues. A lot to think about and a lot to talk about. So who would like to start with a question? If you could introduce yourself, because everything is being recorded, and we'd like to know who's who.
Yeah, my name is Bernard Casey from Frankfurt am Main, and at one time of this place. I want to pick up a term which is being traded around at the moment. Here we see the term global trading system. We heard a lot about multilateral agreements. There was almost an opposition between multilateral and something which is called bilateral, and bilateral seemed to be a less good thing. But we heard only at the end mention of regional relationships and regional agreements, which are a form of multilateral in their own right, of which the European Union is one. Can you say a bit more about relationships with regional partnerships, which might not even be of a particular geographical region, because countries from outside the Asian area are interested in trans-Pacific relationships, even if they are not themselves Pacific countries. So what is the role of this intermediate? Is there a role for it, or is it somehow a lesser thing like everything which is bilateral? Thank you.
Well, I mean, the focus of my presentation today was WTO and multilateral, but that does not mean in any way that it is not a very important element of European Union trade policy. Also, bilateral agreements or region-to-region agreements. We have negotiated a region-to-region agreement with Mercosur, which is still subject to the process of ratification. So certainly we do not see a contradiction between the need to have a functioning system at a multilateral level and countries being ready to go beyond that through bilateral agreements or through region-to-region agreements. Now, when you talk about big unilateral agreements, I suppose that you actually have in mind something like the comprehensive Trans-Pacific Progressive Agreement, which actually I always find it very, very difficult to remember those acronyms. Now, we have certainly nothing against those type of agreements. We as the European Union are not engaged as such, because we have actually bilateral agreements with practically all the countries who form part of the CTPP, and the two important countries which are part of the CTPP, we are negotiating bilateral agreements, and we are quite close to concluding one of them. It will take a little bit more to conclude the other one. I mean, obviously, I'm referring to New Zealand, where there is an intensive discussion now going on to conclude a bilateral negotiation with New Zealand. And with the new political context, I think that our negotiation with Australia, I believe, should probably also get a new dynamic behind them. But the only point which I would like to make, sometimes this argument is being made that if you want to negotiate high-quality rules, you need to negotiate this outside the WTO. You need to negotiate them unilaterally or bilaterally, because that's the only way that you are going to negotiate high-standard agreements. Well, sorry, but that's not true. And that's why I so much emphasize that what we negotiated last week in the WTO on fisheries subsidies is more ambitious than USMCA, United States, Mexico, and Canada. We could have tried to develop a gold standard agreement on fisheries subsidies, and it is more ambitious than what is currently included in the CPP. So I think particularly on some issues like subsidies, it is much more effective to negotiate the disciplines multilaterally than it is to negotiate the disciplines bilaterally, because you always want to be sure that all the key players are bound by the same rules. And by the way, I'm still a little bit curious about what is going to happen on the whole issue of negotiations on digital. I mean, digital is an issue which at this point in time, there are plurilateral negotiations taking place in the WTO. It is something which is not a multilateral agreement, it is a plurilateral agreement, but with the ambition to integrate it in the WTO. Some very difficult issues will have to be tackled, but I'm not sure, by the way, that those issues are going to be easier to tackle regionally or plurilaterally than it's going to be in the WTO. I mean, we of course are following with interest what is happening in the Indo-Pacific with this new construction that has been developed, which, sorry, I cannot remember the acronym, a very complicated acronym as well. But again, if this results in a digital agreement, I'm not sure that it would necessarily be more ambitious than what can be negotiated in the WTO.
There's a question here, Jerry. If you don't, now come.
Thank you for your brilliant presentation. Two questions.
Jerry, good to introduce
Yeah, sure. Okay. Dr. Yu Jie from Chatham House, but also Associate Fellow for LSE IDEAS. Now, I have two questions for you, one on China and one on European Union. Firstly, obviously, what you have discussed so far really give me a glimmer of hope that perhaps China and the United States will be able to come with some kind of rapprochement through trade. Do you consider actually in the actual negotiation is because the characters of those negotiators that make a difference? Because obviously on the China side, you have the Commerce Minister, which is very unusual to attend the LSE meeting, whereas on the other hand, you have Catherine Tai, unlike you have Jack Sullivan or Antony Blinken, those types. So do you actually consider is the personality, and also because the economic interests, those two countries so closely associated together to make them realize come to make concession. Now, the second question is, while we're talking about European Union, and we come to the realization that China has been the largest trading partner with ASEAN these days. Now, the EU is now these days talking about increasing its presence in the Pacific region. Now, to what extent that the EU will be able to compete with China within the region, that expanding its economic presence?
Well, Cherry, two very good and difficult questions. Now, first, no, I'm not sure that really personalities had a lot to do with this. By the way, the negotiations in the last day were done without the presence of the political level. Catherine Tai had flown back to Washington, and the Chinese minister had flown back to Beijing. What I think explains the outcome of this is that first, on the whole question of the waiver, it was very clear that this was the issue that had to be settled between China and the United States. Politically, it was very sensitive, however, to settle it before the end. Because if this issue would have leaked at any point in time before the end of the negotiations, on an issue that was politically quite sensitive in the United States, it would have had quite significant negative impacts. And that's the reason why I'm sure that this was something that had been negotiated between the United States and China for some time, but they could only really come out with it at the end of the day. Now, what is a little bit interesting about fishery subsidies is why China decided to concede. Because, as I said, when we went into the negotiations, we knew that this provision about the prohibition of subsidies on the high seas was one of the issues that China had identified as sensitive for them. And despite that, they had to agree with that because they found that there was a huge pressure to go in that direction. Now, I am sure that this is an issue which China, in their calculations, had understood. This is an issue on which, if it really comes to concluding an agreement, we cannot actually oppose. And they have, therefore, the political instruction to their ambassador that they should be able to compromise on that. Of course, some of the issues that one would need to negotiate in the future with China, for instance, on agricultural subsidies, or even more sensitive on industrial subsidies, are politically much more difficult. And whether there is the dynamic to find a solution to those issues is more complicated, both because of the concession from China would be much more significant, but also because of lack of trust. Because the problem, for instance, when it comes to industrial subsidies is this issue: can we really trust that the rules that we agree are going to be properly implemented? And this problem of lack of trust is going to be one of the issues that will be very difficult to tackle if we were going to move beyond fishery subsidies and tackle some much more difficult issues like agricultural subsidies or, above all, industrial subsidies. I would say this was a good start, but still the trust to make it possible to have a negotiation between the United States and China in a multilateral context, I don't think we are still there. I think this is something that we need to be built up. Now, on the Indo-Pacific, well, I mean, obviously, as you know, we are already quite present in the Indo-Pacific. We have free trade agreements with Japan, with Singapore, and with Vietnam. We are quite close to concluding with New Zealand, and I don't think it will take too long to conclude with Australia. We have now decided to relaunch negotiations with India, which of course will be huge. If we succeed in concluded trade agreement with India, will be huge both economically and geopolitically. So I would say we are present in the region. It is true that there are a number of countries in ASEAN where probably the presence of China is increasing, and we have not yet been able to conclude a trade agreement. We are negotiating with Indonesia, but quite frankly, it's a difficult negotiation. I'm not sure exactly where we will be able to bring it to conclusion between now and the end of this Monday. And there have been signals of interest by other countries in the region, like Malaysia and Thailand. So I think we are also engaged with countries in ASEAN. But it is probably the area where I could see that your question is probably more relevant in terms of China gaining economic advantages vis-à-vis us, or indeed vis-à-vis the United States. The United States has no trade agreements with that region either. But they have much less than us.
There was a question at the back, that young man. Then I'll come back. Who else had their hands up? Okay. Sorry, I didn't see you. Okay.
Thank you.
Hello? Okay.
I'm Silvano.
I work in public
Human. You mentioned. Is it worse? Can you? Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Yeah. You mentioned earlier on about investment screenings as one of the features of the trade security interface. In your view, what should the screenings give priority to, and to who? Like, what should they screen?
Well, I mean, at this point in time, what we have in the European Union is a framework legislation that basically tries to coordinate investment screening activities of the member states, and only in circumstances in which there is a threat to public security. It is not a general screening mechanism. It is always linked into the identification that there is a threat to public to public security. The screening is basically done at the member state level, but they need to inform the European Commission, and the European Commission gives an advice, taking into account also the broader implications for the European Union. So that's the legislation that we currently have at this point in time at the EU level. It is a recent legislation. It was adopted, I think, 4 years ago. But there is some discussion about whether this might need to be reinforced, and that's an issue that we are reflecting whether one might need to go beyond what we currently do, although I would not really expect that the screening would look into factors other than those which are related to security. There is not the intention to do a screening for broader economic type of considerations. The idea would be to continue to very much focus on those areas in which investment may give rise to security concerns.
Yes. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, David Hennig from the European Centre for International Political Economy. Ignacio, thank you for that. Can I tempt you a little further? You almost suggested that the new geopolitics of trade was slightly less ambition at the WTO, that we lost the ambition really to have all rules set by the WTO almost as much as we can at the WTO, at the very least keep it alive, but actually we are going to have to do many things bilaterally or coalitions of the willing. Does that fairly reflect where you're coming to? And is that just accepting a reality that has always been there, or is that something new around today's geopolitics between particularly the US and China?
I think, David, you're putting too much into what I said at the end of my talk. Now, first, one thing which for me is very clear, it's not really going to be possible at the multilateral level to negotiate market access. Do you actually want to negotiate further elimination of tariffs, liberalization of services, procurement? Those are issues that you can only really do at the bilateral level. The conditions for market access negotiations in the WTO are simply not there. Now, when it comes to certain issues like subsidies, quite frankly, you either are able to negotiate in the WTO or you will simply not negotiate about those. Issues like subsidies, by definition, you can only negotiate it in the WTO, ideally multilaterally, if not under different plurilateral configurations. I still think that when it comes to e-commerce, it would make a lot of sense to conclude an agreement in the WTO. Not a multilateral agreement, that is very unlikely to be possible, but the current plurilateral negotiations in the WTO, in my view, are really worth investing on, and it would be interesting also to test the willingness of WTO members to incorporate plurilateral agreements within the WTO architecture. So, no, I mean, I think that in my view, the WTO agenda on rules continues to be very relevant. As I said, at the same time, if you actually want to go beyond on market access, that you would need to tackle it through your bilateral negotiations. Also, you want to deal with sustainability issues, because these politically in the European Union are critical. We would not conclude trade agreements unless there are some commitments relating to sustainability, and we are not really expecting that that will be negotiated with WTO. Those are things that we would need to tackle through our bilateral agreements. So I think, in my view, there's a role for what you can do in the WTO, there's a role for what you can do bilaterally, and as I said, top priority would be finding a way to restore a functioning dispute settlement system. Even if there was going to be no changes on the current rules, we are convinced that the current rules that we negotiated in 1995 continue to be valid, and they need to have a proper enforcement mechanism. Of course, ideally, it would be good to develop them, to have more clarity in the rules on subsidies, to have rules on e-commerce. All those things would be good, but even if nothing of that was going to happen, at least from our point of view, it makes sense to have the rules that we negotiated in 1995 maintained through a binding dispute settlement system.
Now we have 4 questions in the queue. Are there any others who want to ask questions? So we'll start with yours, then over here, then yours, then here, if you don't mind. Okay, then anyone else? You'd like to ask a question? Anyone else? Because we have about half an hour. Okay, just remind me after I've done the 4, and then. Sorry, go ahead. Please introduce yourselves.
Georgia Bagte, I work, I don't know if this is working, okay. I work in the Trade Secretariat in the Cabinet Office. My question is, I think it might take us into WTO reform, but you mentioned using trade for geopolitical purposes, and you mentioned, sorry, I'm going to speak loudly because it doesn't work. So the WTO is set up in a kind of legalistic, neutral, carefully balanced way, and geopolitics doesn't always respect those parameters. So my question is, how do we negotiate that tension? And the example I have in mind, because it just is happening now, is, for example, what if Russia starts bringing challenges against all the measures that the world has introduced in response to the conflict in Ukraine? It is possible that quite a few of these challenges could be lost at the WTO. So in the future, how do we negotiate the tension between those two?
No, that's an extremely good question. Now, I didn't want to enter into a detailed discussion on dispute settlement. But for me, what is clear, because precisely the geopolitical context in which we are living is very different to the one that we had in 1995. I don't think it will be possible to find a solution in dispute settlement reform without a recognition of policy space, at least in two areas. One is anything which has to do with the trade and security nexus. And the other one has to do with trade defense. Now, exactly how to navigate that policy space, how that will be articulated when it comes to dispute settlement reform, that's something for lawyers to find out. But politically, for me, it is very clear that now one can imagine a circumstances in which you were going to be told by a WTO panel or by the appellate body that the type of measure that you have been taking in response to the aggression of Russia and Ukraine are somehow not in conformity with the WTO rules, and you need to adjust them because of the rule of the WTO. By the way, I think in my view the legal risk is very limited. I'm quite convinced that we would win the case without any doubt. But in any case, if by any reason there was going to be a strange panel and there was no control by the appellate body that was going to come to that kind of legal conclusion, that would be absolutely untenable. And trade defense is a little bit more complicated, but it is clear that in the circumstances where there is obviously going to be difficulties to fully capture certain destructive tactics to the rules, you are going to need to have sufficient policy space when you are applying your trade defense instruments. So exactly how to articulate that in the reform of WTO dispute settlement, I don't know. There is a lot of lawyers here who can be reflecting about that, but it's very clear to me that that's something that somehow would need to be recognized. That policy space when it comes to measures that are taken for national security reasons, and to a certain extent also policy space when it comes to the application of trade defense instruments.
Thank you. Yes, can you pass the... It's not working, is it? So you're passing around a dead microphone. Try it.
Hi, I'm Tiffany McDonald. I'm currently a senior advisor with Global Council. I have worked in the past as an Australian diplomat across the whole spectrum of issues from trade policy to security. So I did have a question that touched on the dynamics around Russia being in the room, which I'll ask, but I have a subsequent question because I feel he's probably answered my first question to the extent that you can. But just the idea that Russia was in the room and the WTO is an organisation that makes decisions by consensus. And I know that from a trade perspective, they don't play a significant role in the trade, in the global trading system relative to the much bigger players, but it feels like a missed opportunity from a foreign policy and geopolitical perspective to have allowed them to be in the room and not when the foreign policy establishment is spending so much time trying to find levers for pressuring Russia. You have a member of the WTO in the room having invaded another member and then making decisions, e.g. the TRIPS waiver around health and so forth. Can you just pull on that thread a bit more about what the dynamics were and what the thinking was to have them there, if you can? And the second question, if you'll indulge me, is around the TRIPS waiver and the sort of gentleman's agreement or side agreement about whether or not China will avail itself, even though it falls into scope. That feels like a slippery slope from a legal perspective to have an agreement, but then to have the sort of understanding on the side that even though on paper China would fall within scope of the waiver, they have given us an undertaking that they won't avail themselves to it.
Okay, well, two very good questions. Now, first, on Russia being on the room. Sorry, Russia is a member of the WTO. There's no way that you can actually tell them you have to leave this room. I mean, what authority do we have to actually tell a member of the WTO you have to leave this room? Now, what we made very clear is first, we made together with a number of like-minded countries a formal statement in the General Council saying that in light of the actions that Russia had taken to invade Ukraine and in exercise of our rights in the WTO, we no longer recognize MFN treatment to Russia. And that we made it very clear they can still be in the WTO, but we no longer recognize MFN treatment, which is the most fundamental principle of the WTO. Secondly, we made very clear to the Director General of the WTO that we would not be ready to enter into negotiations with Russia in any small group setting. Of course, in a plenary meeting, the Russian representative is there, made his statement. If the statement touches upon political issues, we walk out of the meeting. If not, we stayed in the meeting. During the ministerial meeting, we took the initiative to organize a meeting of solidarity with Ukraine, where we had a very good participation of countries to show our solidarity and support of Ukraine. And Russia, quite frankly, was not a factor throughout the ministerial. In no occasion was the Russian representative present in any of the small group negotiations. Everything that is negotiated in the WTO is basically negotiated in a small group, and then it is presented for endorsement to the broader membership, and then you have those countries which are necessary to get a consensus on different issues, and there are no circumstances with Russia ever invited to any of those negotiating groups. We assumed that the chair would inform them about what was being discussed, and that Russia decided, okay, fine, we are not going to make an issue about it. But quite frankly, I don't see what else you could actually do. And remember that this is an organization with 164 members. And of those 164 members, 30, 40 members have taken certain action vis-à-vis Russia, others have not. You need to, if you work in a multilateral institution, you need to also respect the views of the other players in that multilateral institution. So all in all, I would say, I think the way that the whole issue of the President of Russia was handled was a satisfactory one. The condemnation of Russia was expressed very, very clearly, particularly in the first day of the conference. The solidarity with Ukraine was expressed very, very clearly. At the same time, we were not going to allow Russia to disrupt the functioning of a very important multilateral agreement, and therefore we insisted it was necessary to work towards ensuring multilateral outcomes, including on certain areas that, of course, there was one of the issues that was agreed in the WTO was the political declaration on food security. It includes a commitment to avoid export restrictions, a commitment to assure transparency. Obviously, it says nothing about what is at the origin of the problem of food security, but it was obvious you cannot have a multilateral agreement on food security that starts by condemning the invasion of Ukraine, because you would never get a multilateral consensus on that, and not just because of Russia. You really need to understand that the position that different countries have been taking on this issue is not the same one that has been taken by the European Union, United Kingdom, Canada, or the United States. Now, on the question of this famous waiver, obviously I would be interested from the views of lawyers, but I have to say that I think that this is extremely well drafted footnote. We have not what it was negotiated between the United States and China, but if you actually look into what the footnote says, okay, developing countries are encouraged to make a binding commitment not to avail themselves of this decision. Such binding commitments include statements made by eligible members to the General Council. And this is where actually China had indicated in the General Council a few weeks before that China had no intention to avail itself of the waiver. Okay, that was a statement made by China in the General Council, but the language which is included in the waiver makes it clear this is now a legally binding commitment. So that's why I think it was quite a clever construction.
Did you pass the microphone for, oh, it's, yeah, this gentleman. You have to sort of.
Hello, I'm Salman Sultan. I'm a student in University in Colombia. I had a couple of questions regarding more of the side of the geopolitics in relation with other questions already made, especially regarding China and the Russian-China alliance. First of all, is it possible that this global trading system starts getting alternatives like a decoupling of the organizations, since many requirements of the WTO are of a higher standard than with other countries. So China doesn't require certain base level commitment like other countries in, for example, the European Union. And whether or not the estimated recessions that are coming, that many analysts think are coming in the future, if they are going to exacerbate this sort of decoupling of the world, like you said, the 2008 financial crisis was an inflection point.
Well, when it comes to the issue of decoupling, let me perhaps differentiate Russia and China. I mean, my impression is that the decoupling from the Russian economy is probably unavoidable, and that's something which is simply going to happen. I mean, I'm not going to speculate about the outcome of the war, etc., how long sanctions will be there or not, but in my view, after what we have been going through in terms of the relationship with Russia, it's very difficult to imagine that you could continue to have a normal trade relationship with Russia for quite some time. So the coupling from the Russian economy, in my view, that's something that is very likely to happen in any case. Russia is not such a huge economy. It is something that is going to imply some transition costs, but costs which can be absorbed. China is, of course, a much bigger player. I think it's very difficult to imagine a decoupling between Europe, the United States, and the China economy. Of course, there's going to be some areas which are at the heart of the technology competition, which have a security dimension attached to it, where, yes, I think you are going to have less dependence that you may actually have vis-a-vis China. Of course, it's going to apply in both sides. China will also probably want to be less dependent on semiconductors from outside China. So there are going to be certain areas which are at the heart of the trade and of the technology security dimension, where there's going to be some degree of decoupling, but it will be very difficult to imagine a generalized decoupling. It will be something that will be extremely costly economically. It would also something that politically would obviously generate a lot of tensions, because we should not forget that many countries trade with China, trade with Europe, trade with the United States, and they are not going to appreciate being said you need to make your choices. You can only trade with one or the other. Which is why, quite frankly, we think that we all have an interest in maintaining a workable rule-based multilateral trading system to ensure that you don't go to a total fragmentation of the global economy. But if we're going to have a collapse of the rule-based trading system, then yes, the tendency towards the total fragmentation of the global economy will become much more difficult to control. So there's going to be less globalization. That was the case over the last 30 years. Although I don't think that you are going to go to a situation in which you have a world which is just totally split into a Russia-China bloc and a Western bloc. Also, because where will you put Africa? Where will you put Latin America? Where will you put Asia? You're going to tell them you need to work with one or the other. I think it's going to be very difficult to imagine how that could actually work in practice.
Questions about recession, coming recession.
The recession. Well, I'm not an economist, but I mean, obviously I was listening the other day to the economic forecast, and it is very clear that the risk of a recession is there. So exactly how far it would go, how deep it would go, that's a different question. But it is, if you add all the headwinds that were there to the consequences of the war Russia-Ukraine, the risk of the recession is something that is there.
Just following on from this question, if there's a recession, will there not be more protectionism, more barriers, more impediments to trade?
That is, well, first, I mean, let's see exactly how deep the recession is. So we are, I think it is certainly a risk that, I mean, actually it's interesting because in a way it's not going to be just, what you are facing it would be the risk of a stagflation. It is something, of course, which has not been experienced since the 70s. And of course, the fact that prices are increasing may also be an argument for, say, you need to open more to trade in order to control inflation. So I think that at least the argument that in a situation of a stagflation, you may also need to look more into trade agreements is probably also something that's going to play. And also because, at least from the European Union perspective, one of the consequences of the current conflict is that we are losing a very important market for the European Union. Russia was an important market for our exports. That is something which is gone, and therefore there's also going to be more interest instead of concluding trade agreements with countries that can provide an alternative source of exports vis-à-vis Russia. But all in all, I agree. I mean, I think how all of this is going to play in the politics of trade is very difficult to say. It may well be that if the economic situation becomes more difficult, that will also be more reluctance to enter into trade agreements.
We have the microphone here, please.
Thank you. Boris Karkov, Department for International Trade. You mentioned e-commerce a few times, and I was interested in what role do you see for the WTO on digital economy issues like data transfers, where those trade and security issues may arise? Thank you.
I think there's basically two issues that we would need to find a way forward between now and the next ministerial meeting. One is that we should not be complacent about this e-commerce moratorium. That's something we had been extended without much discussion for more than 20 years, and I don't think that is the reality anymore. We came very, very close to have a situation in which it would have been terminated in the WTO Ministerial. Now, because of the circumstances in which we were, South Africa, India understood the very significant political consequences of taking that step at this point in time. But we are really going to need to have a serious discussion about this question of policy space if we want to continue to have a situation in which there is a global moratorium on the application of duties on e-commerce. So that is one issue, which is the multilateral dimension. The other issue is, of course, the multilateral negotiations of e-commerce in the WTO, the joint statement initiative on e-commerce, where we are certainly very actively engaged, and where we think that it will make a lot of sense to try to advance those negotiations towards a conclusion. Ideally, by the time of the next ministerial meeting, although it might be a little bit too ambitious. I mean, we all know that the fundamental question that needs to be tackled in that connection is the issue of data flows and data localization requirements, where one would need to find a solution which, at least from our point of view, reassures us that there is in no way questioning our privacy regime. I mean, you know that it's a fundamental issue for us in the European Union. It was also an important issue in our bilateral negotiations with the UK, where we reached, I think, a good bilateral solution. And we are, by the way, also very much engaged now in discussing that issue with other trading partners, including, in particular, Japan. But I think the whole issue about rules on e-commerce in the WTO, in our view, is very important because it will be one of the signals that the WTO can be relevant for global trade issues. And at the end of the day, the negotiations on e-commerce have been making good progress, but there are 2 or 3 fundamental issues that still will need to be need to be tackled, and obviously the most important is your localization requirements and data flows.
Question? Yes, this gentleman. And then after him, the lady behind him, and then we'll go to the man at the back. We'll continue as much as we can. Thank you.
Hi, Marco Curie. I'm also an economist at Department for International Trade. I was going to have a question about plurilaterals, but I feel like you've spoken a lot about plurilaterals. But the general sort of gist of what I was trying to understand from what you said so far is, given the history of plurilateral decision-making in the GATT and how you had a process of unilateral liberalizations, and after every round, these would become formalized within the multilateral framework. Do you see that as a way of trying to frame these plurilateral discussions when they're facing challenges from certain members who argue these are illegal sort of rulemaking within the WTO system? The second question I had was more on the recently published subsidies and multilateral cooperation publication produced by the 4 international organizations, World Bank, WTO, OECD, and IMF. In and of itself is quite significant given these 4 IOs managed to come to some sort of agreement. How do you think the subsidy agenda can be taken forward given that, the role of transparency and evidence and economic sort of economic theory and a theory of harm, if you like? And more generally, I guess, linked to that is how can the role of economics start to be incorporated with the legal world that the WTO finds itself in? And some academics have even argued we need a new economic legal profession to support this this development. Thank you.
Well, I will also answer to your first question because I think it's a very interesting one. Now, I think this legal debate about unilateral agreements in the WTO is a little bit of a false debate. Obviously, I understand why India and South Africa are making that point, but I don't think that is the fundamental issue. For the fundamental issue, we really need to be able to test the system. I'm convinced that if we actually conclude a plurilateral agreement on, say, investment facilitation, and I mention investment facilitation because it's a little bit more advanced than on e-commerce, and we present it to the membership, this is an agreement which has about 120 members, including a large number of countries from Africa. It has no provision whatsoever that in any way harms the interests of countries which are not party to this agreement. What objection you have to integrate this agreement in the WTO, and you have ways to do it, you have Annex 4 of the WTO agreement. I think that's a debate that you need to have. You need to be able to conclude one of these bilateral agreements, you need to put it through the WTO procedure for acceptance of the WTO, and then you will need to have India, South Africa explaining why they are against the inclusion of that agreement in the WTO. I am convinced, quite frankly, that fundamentally the concern of India and South Africa is a legitimate one, but has nothing to do with the legality of bilateral agreements, have to do with their unsatisfaction about the way in which the DDA agenda was closed down. Because India has an interest on agriculture, South Africa has an interest on some issues related to industrial policies, and they feel that these issues are being ignored because the center of gravity of the organization is moving elsewhere. It's moving into plurilateral agreements. So I think that's fundamentally the reason why India and South Africa are so much opposed to plurilateral agreements. As I said, in my view, on the one hand, you would need to discuss the issues of substance with India and South Africa. You would need to be able to conclude the plurilateral agreement, put it to the membership, and then challenge a bit those who object to explain their reasons to object to it. Now, on the whole question about disciplines of subsidies and the study by these international organizations, first, we think it's very good that you have actually had this initiative. Now we need to reflect about what is the best way to take this discussion forward in the WTO. And as you know, we have been very much engaged for quite some time now on this bilateral discussion with the United States and Japan, and actually we will have soon another discussion with them. But I want to tell you a little bit my own personal perspective. Now, at the very least, I would really start with transparency. There are many more challenging issues that would need to be tackled to modernize the rules of the WTO on industrial subsidies. It is much more complex than what we have been discussing in the trilateral a few years ago. For instance, in my view, one would need to look also into the green box. That was something that was included in the Uruguay-bound subsidies agreement, but which lapsed. But at this point in time, I don't think it's realistic to imagine disciplines on subsidies that do not include also some scope for subsidies relating to protection of the environment or for subsidies relating to research and development. Those issues, in my view, would need to be part of any discussion about how to modernize rules on industrial subsidies. But the fundamental problem is the lack of trust that any rules on the subsidies would work with China because of the lack of transparency in which China subsidizes its economy. So my sense is that the starting point for the discussion has to be, is it going to be possible to have an exercise within the WTO, perhaps within the subsidy committee, to enhance transparency? And we are reflecting on ideas about how this could actually be developed. In a way, it can also be seen as being part of the WTO reform agenda, because part of WTO reform is also how to make the committees of the WTO function better. And one could really look into how to make the subsidies committee in the WTO become a better forum to discuss and to understand better the policies that countries are following when it comes to industrial subsidies. This is just something that we are still, I would say, very much reflecting on.
Thank you. Yes, young lady behind. If you speak up, the ceiling mic will pick up your voice.
Hello.
If this doesn't work.
Okay. Hello, I'm Shui from LSE International Political Economy. I just wondering. Okay. Shui from LSE International Political Economy. We know that we have the same tariff for the same product for the trade between EU and the partner outside EU. So, but we also notice like countries within the EU have very different product portfolio. For example, Germany may export more machinery and Italy may export more food and beverage. So thus different countries have a very different weighted average tariff. So I just wondering how would the EU balance this kind of different requests for different countries when during the negotiation for the trade?
Well, the single market is a very integrated market, which means that it is very rare that you actually have any fundamental difference of interest between member states when it comes to negotiations of tariffs in a free trade agreement. Obviously, there are some areas where you have well-known sensitivities, which basically have to do with certain aspects of agriculture. Just a small part of our agriculture tariff lines are very sensitive, but everything else, basically, in all our free trade agreements, we have always been ready to work on the assumption that tariffs will be fully eliminated, and they can be eliminated rapidly. Most of them are entering into force. And it really comes down to the question of what your trading partner is ready to offer you in return. But apart from a very limited number of sensitive agricultural tariff lines, there is really very limited sensitivity relating to tariff negotiations in the European Union. It's basically just trying to get as good concessions in return as possible.
Does that answer your questions? Gentleman at the back.
Thank you.
No, the one behind you.
One behind you.
Okay, we have a consensus.
I'll ask my question in later on in the reception.
Hello.
If you speak loudly, it'll pick up your voice.
Hello. My name is João Oliveira. I work in agribusiness industry back in Brazil. And in addition to the discussion of how governments should respond to issues like the war in Ukraine, back in Brazil there is a discussion about how private companies and sector associations should also play a role in this kind of issues management. Some companies have chosen to withdraw from the Russian market, for example, due to this crisis in Ukraine. So I'd like to know your views on if, as part of this new geopolitics of trade, private companies and private sector associations should also play a bigger role in this kind of discussions.
Well, I mean, it's very clear that what is happening with the invasion of Ukraine is such a huge issue that I think many companies are also taking decisions which are based on their own reputational costs. And it is clear that many companies, European companies which are operating in Russia, have decided to leave the Russian market, not because they are being required to do so, but because they basically think that is the right thing to do, or that is the right thing to do from the reputational point of view. I was not aware that it was also the case for companies in Brazil, but I think it is very clear that what is happening at this point in time is of such nature that many companies have decided to take certain decisions, not because they are required to do so, but because they simply think it's the right thing to do.
The gentleman just in front of you, and then if there's time, you've got a few minutes before we break. I'll ask Ivor to ask a question.
If you just speak up, I think that might...
Just speak up. You don't have to stand up.
Okay, but thank you. Global food trade is heavily destabilized. Does WTO has any role in helping the situation?
Well, obviously the reason why global trade is very destabilized is because Ukraine is not able to export its wheat, its agricultural products from Ukraine because of their ports being blocked by Russia. Now, that is not something that can be solved by the WTO. That's something in which obviously different efforts are being made to try to find a solution. What the WTO could actually do at this point in time was to make clear that export restrictions would aggravate the problem rather than contribute towards food security. So that's what was agreed in the WTO, in the food security declaration, which has in particular a commitment to avoid as much as possible any export restriction, and also a commitment not to apply any export restrictions to the World Food Programme, so that the activities of the World Food Programme in terms of providing the food aid are not negatively impacted by export restrictions. So that's what was agreed in the context of the WTO.
Thank you. Final question over here, Ivan. You have to raise your voice.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks very much, both for a brilliant talk, but for very good answers to the questions. I want to ask a governance question, really, as you would expect from me. If you think back to early century, we ended up with the G20 because the G7 was patently illegitimate, and you needed a global forum to manage globalization 1.0. And to a degree, the G20 did it, at least in the financial crisis. As you say, the beginning of the, a levelling off, the start of reversal. But it was a Gordon Brown and Paul Martin initiative to create the G20. You needed a G20 because the G7 didn't do the job, couldn't manage globalization. You needed an economic forum which had genuine legitimacy and coverage of the major players. G20 now doesn't work for obvious reasons, so it can do some things, but not much. It's basically exploded, and we all know it. What you referred to as the kind of trade security resilience. So there's a huge set of issues now, which, as you say, WTO can't conceivably manage. As you say, it's kicked off in the G7, but that isn't going to work either. And I'm afraid my own experience in the G7 is it does trade discussions very badly. It has the wrong people in the room. Yeah. So there's a long preamble to the impossible question, which is, are there EU ideas? Is there EU thinking about what new institutional forum needs to be created to do the work on trade security resilience? Because that's the exam question for the next 12 months, if not the next 12 weeks, it seems to me.
Excellent question, Ivan. Well, there's thinking going on. Now, in reality, who would you actually need to have in those discussions? Apart from those who are in the G7, you would probably want to have Australia. You would probably want to have Korea. You may want to have New Zealand. You're basically talking about those countries that have a common concern about coercive action by a certain big country, and who would want to see how they can coordinate their policies in response to such coercive action, and also more generally in terms of how they implement a number of tools like investment screening, export controls. To a certain extent, it is something that we are doing bilaterally with the United States. It's one of the issues that we are handling in the context of the Trade and Technology Council. One of the reasons why it has been possible for us to coordinate much better the sanctions vis-à-vis Russia because of the conflict that have been created through the TTC process. But exactly what would be the right way to do this institutionally, it cannot just be the G7, and you are right that the way that the G7 works is not necessarily the most effective way to handle these issues. But I'm afraid that we still haven't come with the magical governance solution for that.
And just on geography, if I may, I mean, no Latin American, no African. I mean, I understand why Korea, why New Zealand, why Australia, but again, you're going to have a legitimacy.
Well, in a way, there are two different issues. One is how you actually try to respond, how you try to manage the trade security nexus, and that's probably going to be a relatively small circle. Now, of course, a different issue is how to engage with those emerging economies that now that the G20 is not really working, how you can ensure that you can engage with Brazil, that you can engage with India, that you can engage with South Africa, all of which are clearly going to be critical players, for instance, in the WTO agenda. And that we may want to reflect if the G20 is no longer fulfilling a useful role on global trade issues, where it is that you can actually engage with those countries which are clearly of the global south, but which actually have an important role to play.